Well, Mike, thank you so much for the chance to join in, and to each of you, I really appreciate the opportunity to share with you the story of 60 Hertz. Um, there have been numerous barriers to transcend, and in each instance, it never dawned on me at the time that it was a barrier. But rather, I realized that if I prayed, there would be a solution to whatever problem was presenting itself. So I'll tell you the story of 60 Hertz today through the lens of how learning more about God and reality through Christian Science ended up breaking a barrier. Some years ago, I shifted from believing in Christian Science culturally, familially, out of habit, to realizing, what if all of this is real? What if all of the statements in Science and Health were mine to experience and to demonstrate? And of course, we know all of this is real. There is a wonderful science fiction writer, acclaimed Ursula K. Le Guin, and she once wrote of the improbability of the real. This phrase, even taken out of context, speaks to me of the reckoning that sometimes must take place if we need to break a barrier. We may need to transcend a mortal incredulity or disbelief in the simplicity and the harmony of the God I view. We may need to transcend the mesmerism of fear or pessimism of mortal experience. And when we think about mortal experience, I love the definition that it, like matter, are simply anything that limits. And rather, what we know in the Bible, what cannot God do? With Christ, all things are possible. Or even as Mary Baker Eddy has it, impossibilities never occur. So really, barriers always seem external to our experience, but they are only ever a limiting belief, internalized, perhaps a world belief that we got duped to accept, or a state of our own thought. And as I prepared and thought through this talk, I realized even clearer how in each instance, the 5 barriers that I'll tell you about through stories were exactly that, a state of my own consciousness that had to be purified and uplifted. So the 5 barriers that I'll present in this talk are: first, gender; financial; a barrier of place; a barrier of personnel; and the barrier of comparing ourselves to others. So to kick it off, how did 60 Hertz begin? For starters, what is 60 Hertz? 60 Hertz is an operations and maintenance software platform for renewable energy assets. And like the picture behind me, it is used on rooftop solar at the commercial or industrial scale, as well as for solar storage, microgrids in a community or large utility scale. The name 60 Hertz refers to the frequency at which electricity is distributed, particularly in the North American context. If you're from another country, you may know that it is distributed at 50 Hertz. I have long prayed in my career, how can I be a solution? And so it wasn't surprising to me that after moving to Alaska upon getting married, I was a good sport to go with my husband for a year, and that was almost 10 years ago. This idea of the software platform came to mind. It was the only time in my life this has happened, but there was a complete download of the idea of what was needed and how this could be a solution. So essentially, I was at the grocery store early on a Saturday morning, and I saw a gentleman take the lid off of the commercial ready ice maker. You've probably seen these in the grocery store yourself. And he had a mobile phone held up to the control panel at the top of that ice maker. And that was the first time I'd ever thought about how technology could be used to help solve maintenance problems. I was very aware of maintenance problems because my job in Alaska at that time was looking at indigenous village scale microgrids, of which there are more than 200 across the Alaskan Arctic and many more in the Canadian Arctic. And there were lots of issues with millions of dollars of clean energy, renewable energy infrastructure, let alone legacy diesel infrastructure, failing within years of being installed because the maintenance personnel in the village were often had not had the benefit of much training, and we're pinch hitting in some cases, and yet we're responsible for the uptime of these assets. And so I wondered if an app could make a difference. And that little idea has grown. Now, today, we are working on fleets of microgrids across the US and Canada, in Nigeria, Sierra Leone, and we have hundreds of megawatts of sites under management, including many in North America as well, even large acres of solar, where the workers there and the asset managers use our software. We're in 8 countries. There are more than 250,000 maintenance records filed on our platform a year. And this has all been entirely the growth that God has given over the last 9 years. And so the first barrier I'm getting to with that background, within 2 weeks of giving notice that I was going to leave my job in order to start 60 Hertz, I realized that I was pregnant with our first child. And I asked myself questions like, is it possible to be starting a company and be pregnant at the same time? I was only worried about like pregnancy, let alone actually being a mom and running a company. But like a good Christian Scientist, I did 2 things. I started crying and I Googled the problem. I will tell you that a good cry with my mom actually did help. There was a lot of moral support there. Googling startup pregnant did nothing for me. And so naturally, to overcome this first barrier of being a woman, starting a family and a tech company really depended much more. Resolving that barrier was a question of prayer. And I knew that 60 Hertz was an idea that had come from God. It was not willful on my part, and neither was the baby. And I trusted the spiritual law that was early shared with me by a wise woman, that babies are always a blessing and bring with them their own supply. And that the success of this company was not going to be impaired by welcoming a child, and neither could this baby's childhood be impaired by what seemed to be a professional calling. And so things naturally progressed during those 9 months of the maternity, as well as the company. This included being invited to join a startup accelerator that included a little bit of money. I grew a team that ultimately also enabled us to raise our first round of venture capital. We gained a 6-digit customer, and I had a lovely and generous maternity leave at the same time that the initial prototype of our software was deployed in the field, thanks to the support of our team. My husband and my parents have been an enormous support at every step over the last years, providing a loving childhood with lots of attention to my children. And of course, I've been able to too, and have been largely freed of any mom guilt or false responsibility from the thought that I'm not doing a good enough job, or some world beliefs around that. And it's always been really clear to me, the spiritual fact that my daughter is God's. I will say that balancing these both have demanded some heroics at moments. Once I missed a flight from Denver back to Anchorage, and was so distraught wanting to be home right away with family that I linked together a series of other flights, but it only got me as far as Seattle, where I needed to sleep on the floor of the airport. And all I had with me was the tablecloth from our exhibition booth. So I curled up, wrapped in a 60 Hertz tablecloth, and awoke the next morning at like 5 a.m. freezing cold to a high heel kind of right here in my face, because the airport was actually quite crowded and someone was sitting like on top of where I was needing to sleep. I did make it home, and all was well, but it has not always been pretty. And as further proof of the positive coexistence of babies and intense businesses, I'm happy to share that 5 years after starting 60 Hertz, I delivered a son, our baby Otto. And I was tempted to worry again about the ability for children and business to coexist. Unfortunately, at that point, the company was in dire financial straits. And so I had to revisit feelings of embarrassment or guilt that I had a new baby. And I feared that investors would question my fidelity to our company and their, extensive investment at that point. And around this time, a rash developed on my son. We prayed deeply. We worked with a practitioner over this time point about both the baby and 60 Hertz financial stability. And all at once, a piercing truth came to light, which was I realized that this child in my life would not and could not deface the promise of the business. The rash was on his face. And similarly, that there was nothing about this business that could deface our son. And there was a lovely healing. And I'll tell you more about how the funding was resolved around that time point later. Another barrier that has consistently been addressed is about supply, financial supply. Startups like mine, which is a female founded business, this is to say when the CEO and any member of the founding team is female, that globally teams that look like my business partner and I receive just 2 to 3% of total venture capital invested in any year. Investors are very reluctant to fund, unfortunately, female-run teams. This has been the case for decades, even though lots of research shows that female-led businesses perform better and have better outcomes. So it is statistically hard to raise this capital. Fortunately, I didn't know that when I first needed to start raising venture capital, but I was praying through every round of our fundraise. And here's where Christian Science has helped so much to transform this limiting belief. At every round, as they're called, I have prayed to understand that supply is really a spiritual function. And this can be kind of hard for the human mind to accept, that what we consider money, resources, new ideas, partnerships never come through a person. And I know I still have more to learn about this, but there have been some remarkable examples of demonstrating our supply. We have raised to date more than $5 million over 6 rounds. I've had the chance to talk with more than 150 investors and funds, and it's been largely a positive experience. There was a moment in which we needed capital rather urgently. These seemed to come up. And I was attending a conference. I was praying deeply to understand that God's gifts are not from a fund or an investor, but that really from our Father, Mother, God. And I was clear about this. I closed the lesson. I closed my books. I closed the conference room, the hotel room door to walk down to the conference. I stepped into the elevator. The doors closed, and a text came through providing a $50,000 grant from one of our investors. They hadn't even known of the need, but they had some grant money available. So really, before I even got to the ground floor, this need had been met. There have been nights that I have awakened in the middle of the night and needed to handle fear. I have learned not to stay in bed stewing, but to turn on the light and get up and listen, read, study until the peace comes. I'm sure I'm not at all alone in this room having had that experience, but don't we all know that this is really kissing the cross, as Mary Baker Eddy says? And so for any of us struggling with anxiety or fear for any reason, just the gift of deepening the quality and length of our prayer time, and taking the practical steps of closing out the day, let the last thoughts of consciousness be those of gratitude, and ensuring that the first thoughts are to acknowledge that I am one with my Father, Mother, God, in service to Father, Mother, God. Of course, I never, ever start the day in bed, or even until after study time has taken place looking at email, or at my phone. I think this is where the 10 Commandments and having no God before God is just such practical and obvious and timeless help for all of us. The third barrier is that I live in Alaska. Many tech startup companies, especially in the 2015 to 2020 era, when I was initially raising and starting, were based only in California, in Silicon Valley. And in the minds of some investors, getting over jokes about moose or flannel shirts was really challenging to imagine a female-led company and in Alaska, in a place that was emotionally and imaginatively very far away. However, there have been many points of gratitude for our base in Alaska, including investments from the city of Anchorage, And our first major customer was an Alaskan utility run by a woman who took a chance on us and provided that first contract. From an employer standpoint, we've had the opportunity to employ a diverse team. This would have been challenging given the fewness of people and the lack of tech talent in Alaska. However, even before COVID and before it was cool, we had a hybrid office, and I've had the opportunity to employ a very diverse global team. It was a privilege, remains a privilege to have had coming up on 7-year contract with a Ukrainian software development team. My co-founder, Tanya James, who I've alluded to, was a soldier. She saw combat in Afghanistan. And there was a harrowing moment in the first month of the Ukraine-Russia war where we were very concerned with about 5 of our developers who were scattered across the country. Tanya provided basic street combat training to our developers via Slack during this time period. We knew that many of our developers fled to safety. There are others with whom we've lost touch. I was grateful to bring our technology back to Ukraine to help with the maintenance of water treatment systems throughout 2023 via a contract with Water Mission, which helps with water and sanitation systems in conflict zones and emerging markets. And that contract came about solely as the result of God's grace and through prayer. The third, maybe I'm on the fourth barrier, is that of personnel, finding people, finding the right staff. One of the most precious stories is the following. I had been serving in the Christian Science reading room at our branch church in Anchorage, and I had really been reaching out to understand more about new members, encouraging others to come to church, knowing what a phenomenal resource Christian Science is. And what came so clearly to me one Saturday was that it is not up to me, it's not up to any of us, but rather God brings his lambs to church. The very next day, it was a Sunday, and someone I'd never seen before, an Alaska Native man, came in. I welcomed him after the service and asked some questions and learned that his grandmother had been a Christian Scientist. He'd even once had a subscription to the Christian Science Monitor, and he wanted to check out a church service. Importantly, I also learned that he spoke Yupik, which is an indigenous Alaskan language, and a number of our early software users spoke Yupik. And it seemed that translating elements of our app and the training videos into this language would help them. So he offered to volunteer to accomplish this task before he said, no, we want to pay you. But it came to light that he was working through a very delicate and pivotal period in his life. He was exiting the criminal justice system. It was our absolute privilege to employ him and to be confidants and supports to him during the time period of probation. He now, 6 years later, is not only on the team, but an integral member of our team. And he leads the configuration of our software for new customers, which also reflects tremendous growth because he did not know how to type when he first started working with us. He continues to come to church. He is an inspiration to me all the time. And I learned just last year that he listened to all of Science and Health while he played Minecraft in the evenings. This is a video game, as you might not a violent one. And he has also mailed, I think, nearly a dozen copies of our textbook to people in his family and circle. We have also, struggled, I would say, to find what are called chief technology officers. This has been a significant barrier for the company. Tanya and I are considered non-technical founders, which means we are not software developers. And so as a result, we need to lean on this role and partner. We have ultimately gone through 7 different individuals for the role. I know that we made a lot of mistakes, and we were so naive in knowing how to execute on this. But as a result, the product was pretty rough and there were bugs and it wasn't performing as it should have. So I'll spare you the details on the hire and fire of the first six, but number seven culminated with when I felt like I was about 10 months pregnant with my son. 2 weeks before Christmas that year, I was under the weather with a cold, and the CTO, who'd only been with us for 6 months, resigned in a huff. There was a clerical error made by one of our benefits subcontractors, and he hadn't gotten a payment on time, and he was very angry. And so my business partner and I were very concerned that he would delete or harm our code base because he had the keys to these, given the tenor of his departure. I had already been praying fervently about a range of things, but this provided a whole new impetus to it. I was working with my Christian Science teacher, and there was a heartfelt, deep moment when she said, "Don't forget, the battle is not ours, but Christ's." And I had this powerful vision or sense of being on a high cliff or plain watching an approaching army below, but I knew that I was safe and not alone, but with Christ. I was safe, the baby was safe, the code was safe. My business partner had a logical idea to phone an advisor who talked her through how to download and replicate a copy of our code base. We didn't know how to do that at the time, and to save it. That CTO moved on silently. We never heard from him again, and all was well. And earlier that month, I had been working and praying, anticipating that something was going on with the CTO. And I was working with a practitioner about our sob story, and he said, "Who is your true CTO? The Bible tells us that Christ Jesus was a carpenter, but in the Greek, the word is tekton, which is the root word in English of tech or technology. Christ as the real sense of technology." This was totally profound. That was a transformative moment also in our travail with CTOs. That has no longer been an issue since. What's more, around this time, there was a God-given idea for a new product that came to mind to use satellites to determine the degree of solar generation loss at large-scale solar assets that are impacted by wildfires. I learned of a government program through NOAA that I could apply for to get a grant to develop this idea. In the midst of applying, another technology company seemed right to partner with, and we invited them. But the day that this initial application was due, they backed out and said that they wanted to apply on their own with a similar idea, thus attempting to steal and compete. I prayed through this. I was invited to submit a formal application. I don't know what happened to that other firm. In the 3 days before this second and formal application, our grant writing team said, "You need to find a data scientist." I didn't even really know what a data scientist was at this point. So I posted on LinkedIn, "Do I know what a data scientist?" And within 30 minutes, a long lost friend of mine from Heinz said, "I don't know what you need, but I might be able to help you. I am a data scientist." Turns out he had worked for Lockheed Martin and Boeing on energy related projects. He then stayed up most of the night with me on the phone, completing the application for this grant. He utterly transformed it. We were successful. We were awarded 2 rounds of significant funding to create this algorithm that had come to mind. We now have a patent pending on the algorithm and are working with some of the largest solar asset owners in the country to deploy it. And a sweet PS is that as we were working to develop partnerships with industry, someone who needed what we were building, on one of our first prospect calls with one of the largest asset owners and developers in the country, it came to light that our key contact had gone to high school with us. So the 3 of us from Palmer High School, united by mind, to execute together on this powerful idea. And she's been a beautiful advocate for 60 Hertz at her company. Finally, the last barrier, comparing myself to others. Often at conferences, we will be at a table and you can see what all of your competition is doing in the same expo hall, let alone on LinkedIn, which happens quite a bit too. One of our colleagues sauntered by and said, I don't even know why I'm going to the office anymore. The cash is just rolling in. And someone else was bragging about having doubled his revenue in the year. And my co-founder and I, this was not our experience. It was very disheartening. And I was particularly fixated on the market traction and success of a partner, well, who was really a competitor in the space that we had offered to help, but they had rejected any affiliation in a prior year. Well, that evening after the conference, I began feeling unwell and I was filled with angst about our prospects in place. And it was tempting to feel that everyone was better than us. But what does Christian Science teach us about identity and niche? Our identities include our niche. A niche, by definition, is filled but not crowded. We are called but not competitive. And this was actually one of the first spiritual laws that I ever learned, that you will never have an opportunity without the ability to meet it. And you'll never have an ability without the opportunity to meet it. That is a spiritual law. So that night I sought out what my pastor was saying to me. I read the Bible lesson and I came away with an utterly clear sense that the voice of my colleagues and their success did not need to intimidate or threaten, but that was mine too, the universal law of good. I also felt called by God to love that competitor that was so vividly in my face and to bless them. The next day was rich with leads and connections and promise. And as vendors were breaking down their booths to head home, I was led and almost physically had to connect with this competitor. He was standing right in front of me. I again offered partnership and collaboration and found it easy to speak with him with respect, empathy, and appreciation. And I felt the same in return. His presence in the market has not cost us or our business, and no more have I suffered any of this emotional trigger around him. God does not compare his children. None of us are living a life of self-worth judged in comparison with snapshots of others. But the majesty of God's creation is never subjected to scrolling. I found comfort in the Bible passage from Ezekiel. Behold, all souls are mine. God's law of identity means that our individuality, in which we are already enough and always will be, is a law. In conclusion, breaking barriers demands the humility to ask God for help. In my case, this was really easy because at no point have I really known what I'm doing next. But that being on the knees, asking earnestly does really pay off. I think that Instagram can make us think life is easy for everyone, but it isn't. And neither would we want it to be. We do insist on harmony, but ideally this comes with great stretching and spiritual growth, within which is a deep quiet. Finally, success. This is a word that has a lot of mortal beliefs around it. First, we think it's defined only by financial attainment. Then we think it's something that we have to earn if we work hard, something fragile once attained, something not open to all, something elusive. Mrs. Eddy references success frequently in her writings without any of that context. And while I'm cautious that Christian Science is not a path to the prosperity doctrine that would imply that prayer is a tool to obtain financial wealth, abundance is natural and biblical. A prayer I often pray for 60 Hertz is that from Psalm 1. And he shall be like a tree planted by the rivers of water that bring forth his fruit in his season. His leaf shall not wither, and whatsoever he doeth shall prosper. So what if success were a quality that was innate to us all, given by God's grace, not earned, reliable, as consistent as our health, beauty, joy, and energy, never just out of reach, never perverted to be money alone, never in service to personal ego, but always to witness God's glory. Indeed, this is the substance of success. So in conclusion, I hope this discussion about some barriers that faith has helped me overcome will serve as a testimony and witness to God's utter grace, God's supply, and yet another life transformed by the reliable law of seeking and drawing close and uniting scientifically with divine love. Thank you.